Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. Emily Resseger is our speaker today, and she's the principal environmental scientist at Met Council, and she received her MS in Water Resources Science from the University of Minnesota in 2013. She's going to talk about flood vulnerability. Thank you.
Thanks. So, like Professor Mulla said, with Metropolitan Council, and I'm going to talk to you about some work we've been doing to understand flood vulnerability in the Twin Cities and looking at the Metropolitan Council resources and how vulnerable they are. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give a little bit about me since I'm a graduate of this program, then an overview and background on why the Council's been looking at flood vulnerability, talking about an approach to looking at localized flooding we've come up with and how we developed that, and then how we've been using this method to look at the vulnerability of some of the Council's systems, including transit, wastewater, and water supply. So who am I? I'm a mathematician in civil engineering, civil engineer, that's what my bachelor's degrees are in. Then I worked for 5 years in consulting engineering at Bonastro, which has now been bought by Stantec. So I was working in consulting in the Twin Cities, working with communities, doing water resources work. But then I decided I wanted to do more science. So it started 10 years ago, seems crazy, in my WRS master's program, fall of 2009. I defended in January of 2013. My master's project was called Wind Variability over a Small Wind Sheltered Lake, and I was looking at how things like trees and hills can affect small lakes and keep them from mixing fully. And then now I've been at Met Council for 8+ years. I'll talk a little bit more about what Met Council is in a minute. And I do a really wide variety of things, but I would summarize them as I help communities in the region manage water quantity and quality. That can involve planning, working with communities on their local surface water plans. We have a really large monitoring program at the Met Council of the major rivers, tributary streams, and lakes in the region. So I do a tiny bit of monitoring, but mostly I help out managing data and databases, which is sometimes more fun than it sounds. Doing some analysis of the data, including calculating pollutant loads and looking at trends in water quality. And then more and more often, I have been doing some collaboration outreach work with regional partners, including cities, watershed districts, counties. We've been trying to work on getting a lot more consistency in monitoring and assessment in the region. I wanted to point out, I put in this horrible photo because I looked for 8 years of the work I've done at my council. This is the only photo I could find with part of my face in it. And I had no photos of my really cool weather station that I got to deploy for 4 months on a lake in northern Minnesota. No pictures of me with the weather station. So my recommendation is have people take pictures of you doing your research and doing your job. I am the photo taker at the Met Council, and that means there's only this horrible photo of me. So that's my advice. So for those who don't know, the Met Council is the regional policymaking body, planning agency, and provider of essential services for the Twin Cities. It's pretty unique. It's the regional government agency for all 7 counties, including Minneapolis and St. Paul, so it's unique around the country. And we have really wide-ranging authority and connections. So transportation, which includes Metro Transit buses, trains, wastewater collection and treatment. We have, I think it's 8 wastewater treatments. We just acquired one. And a large system to collect wastewater. We do planning and development. We work with especially counties to support regional parks, and we do some work with housing. All of that is to help foster efficient and economic growth for a prosperous region. So, at the council, we have spent the last 5 years undertaking a regional climate vulnerability assessment. This was something that was part of our Thrive 2040 long-term plan, and that's sort of what drove completing this. There was a lot of flexibility about what this regional climate vulnerability assessment could be. And what we narrowed in on was looking at impacts to the region from water, including floodways and localized flooding, and then heat, which would be urban heat island effect. What this meant was we took a two-pronged approach. We came up with some assessment methods, and then we looked at all of our regional systems and assets for vulnerabilities and are working still to come up with some strategies to address these vulnerabilities. But then part of the goal was for this to be helpful to communities in the area, so they could develop their own strategies and use the tools we had developed. So why did we focus on rain and heat? This is some data from the State Climatology Office, and what it shows is for each of the major climate hazards that we're aware of, how likely the Climatology Office thinks there is to be a major change by 2099 in each of these hazards. So they are most confident we will see changes in warming winters, extreme rainfall, and heat waves. For this, we focused on extreme rainfall and heat waves, where we're very sure we're going to see increased frequency and magnitude of events and unprecedented flash floods. And we're very sure we are going to see more hot days that are going to have longer duration heat waves. We would have liked to have looked at warming winters, especially looking at freeze-thaw conditions and how that would affect our assets, but we didn't have the capacity. I think we may go back and look at warming winters and drought in the future. And I would recommend, if you ever see the opportunity to see a talk by someone from the State Climatology Office like Kenny Blumenfeld, he gives a really good talk about all of this stuff and goes into great detail, and he's really entertaining, so check that out. So I am just talking about localized flooding. Someone else worked on heat, and if you're interested in heat, I can definitely put you in touch with somebody to talk about that. But so flooding. We all think we know about flooding, but I'm just going to take a step back to the basics. Types of flooding. We have riverine flooding, which is when extended rainfall or snowmelt causes a river to exceed its capacity. These are the big floods we see. This is St. Paul, I think in the spring, the Mississippi and St. Paul. This happens almost every spring, sometimes in the fall on major rivers. And this is what FEMA floodplains do a pretty good job of covering what the hazards are. But in our state, there's also localized, or you'll sometimes hear it called urban flooding, which is when high intensity rainfall creates a flooded area independent of an overflowing water body. So let's dive into that a little bit more. This localized flooding is almost always caused by overwhelmed drainage systems. By that, we usually mean storm sewer systems. For any city, county, MnDOT, their storm sewer is designed to have the capacity for some rainfall event. Could be rain that occurs every 5 years, rain that occurs every 10, 25. MnDOT especially designs their newer storm sewers at low points to be the 50-year event. So there's a lot of danger in highways flooding. We go at very high speeds, so they really want to avoid having highways flood. So they designed to a 50-year event. Some of Minneapolis's older systems may not even be able to handle a 2-year event. So it really depends on the age and situation. But regardless, intense rain events can overwhelm any of these systems. If MnDOT's designed to a 50-year, when we get a 100-year, it can't handle it. It may only pond a little bit, but every single storm sewer can be overwhelmed. And the key here is that these are likely to become more frequent. We've seen them for as long as we've had storm sewer, but we're seeing them have greater flooding and more often. And we really felt like this was an under-acknowledged risk. We started this project like 3.5 years ago. There actually have been a number of papers, and some universities have been doing some more research on this urban localized flooding, but when we started, there wasn't a lot of documentation on it. The council's systems, I think, are fairly designed with the FEMA floodplain in mind, and I think communities also tend to design their roads. They don't put houses in the FEMA floodplain. They don't necessarily think about this localized flooding when they're designing or operating their systems. So that's why we dove into that a little bit more. So wanted to show an example of one of these. This was from this summer, July 16th. This is a map that shows, this is Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul is over here. We are here. The red areas got more than 2 inches of rain in 1 hour. Probably St. Paul campus got somewhere a little bit less than 2. I was at a doctor's appointment over here on the East Bank, and I had to stand in the lobby for an hour while like torrential rain came down, like solid for an hour. It was amazing. This area is on like Lindale in South Minneapolis, and this area is sort of out by St. Louis Park. What's really important to note is this area got 2 inches of rain in an hour. This area got no rain in an hour. I looked at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, which is like right here. It got 0.03 inches. So we're talking 2 inches to 0.03 over a 3-mile period. We often will use the weather from the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport as a surrogate for rain or wind around the metro. And this is where it shows that we really need local information because the system just came out of nowhere and it just stalled. So do you think that there was any localized flooding from this rain? There was. This is just an article that was in the Southwest Journal, and I have some better photos in a minute, but showing flooding right by Hum's Liquor at Lindale and 22nd, and it was about thigh high, so 3 feet deep probably. Here's somebody trying to bike outside the wedge. I would not have done that, but they look fine. And then this is Garfield and 22nd, so I'll show a map later, but sort of around the corner where cars were floating. And if you guys do anything with like weather and current events, Twitter is the way to go. Like you find the coolest photos on Twitter for stuff like this. And then also over by that St. Louis Park area, this photo down here is from Highway 394 at Penn. So that's on 394 where cars are used to going 60 to 70 miles an hour and the water's at least a foot deep. And that's where we're really talking about dangers. So we know from the State Climatology Office we're going to get more of these events. And these photos show us that these events, well, you know, they may not be the Mississippi River flooding, are dangerous and they can cause a lot of property damage. So what we would like to know is, are there locations where they're going to happen more often, and are there ways that we can mitigate that? But there are some challenges to understanding these kind of flooding events. In the Twin Cities region, we don't have comprehensive storm sewer information. Storm sewer information tends to be held by cities that keep it sort of separate, and then MnDOT has their own storm sewers, counties have their own storm sewers. Those systems don't talk to each other very well. There is an initiative going on right now that I'm on the team for to come up with a standard that all storm sewer information could be put into so we could share it. I think that's going to be successful, but it's a lot of work and they're just kicking off pilots now, so it's a couple, 3 or 4 years away. Even if we had one comprehensive GIS layer of all the storm sewer in the region, right now, and I'm not sure ever, do we have the ability to model it hydrodynamically at the level we're talking about to really understand where flooding will occur. I used to do that kind of modeling. The XP Swim or the SWIM model is really well situated to do surface flooding and how it relates to underground storm sewer, but it is really computationally intensive and it takes a lot of work to set up all of that pipe information. The 7-county metro area is 3,000 square miles. That XP Swim is a really good fit for a city, part of a city, couple streets. I don't know that it's ever going to work for the 7-county metro. And when we're talking about the Met Council, we have resources all over the 7-county metro. So we needed something that would work for us. So the approach we took is based on a Danish road directorate method. It turns out the Danes are much more advanced in terms of looking at this kind of flooding. And it uses a digital elevation model, which if you guys don't know what that is, it's a GIS model that shows the elevation of the ground at any place on Earth. And this method uses GIS terrain analysis tools. I used ArcGIS to identify basically all low spots where ponding can occur. As an aside, I don't know if you guys are all familiar with the Minnesota LiDAR initiative. LiDAR is light detection and ranging. It's in this case where you fly a plane over some land, you shoot light, many light beams at the ground, it reflects, and based on that reflection, you can tell the elevation and also you can tell some things about that land. I actually used it for my master's project to look at trees. The state spent a lot of money and effort gathering LiDAR over the entire state from 2006 to 2012, when they processed this data into a number of products, including a statewide 1 meter and 3 meter DEM. So that's really valuable information, and we wouldn't have been able to do this. The previous DEMs were, I think, usually at the like 30 meter scale, and when you're thinking about flooding in roads, 30 meters doesn't work. So the 3 meter DEM was key. So make use of that data if you're not. It is being updated. So how does this localized flooding method work? It's pretty simple. If this is a profile of the landscape, so there's some valleys, there's some hills, so that's the DEM, and then these GIS tools basically fill up each of the low points until they overflow down to the next low point. So it just has a method where it fills that with pixels, and then we get a map of all of those. So if this is a DEM, it's part of the 3 meter DEM with a couple of streets, and that light colored blue in the middle is the low point. The localized flooding map looks like that. So it just fills in each of those low points. And these are called, the Danes named them Bluespots. So I'll use that term. It's very scientific. So we have this Bluespot map for the entire metro. All these just blue dots. But we really want to look at risk to our systems, and every part of a Bluespot is not equal. Depending on where you are in that low point, it may flood more frequently and it may flood deeper, so the consequences are really different. And so just identifying a Bluespot and saying this is a risk is not very helpful. This Bluespot is in Egan, which is a really prairie pothole area of a lot of hills and valleys, and it's 2.1 square miles and 70 feet deep at its deepest. So if you were to tell, and there's highways in there, malls, if you were to tell a shop owner, you're in a Bluespot, it might flood someday. If we can fill up 2.1 square miles at 70 feet deep, which will never happen, it's like a biblical flood times many, that's not helpful for them to know, but there are parts in that Bluespot that are local depressions, or the deepest part, and they're actually maybe likely to flood more frequently. So we needed a way to go within the Bluespot and understand what has the highest and lowest risks of flooding. So part of how we did this is we thought about the assets that the council is interested in and what depths of water are really going to be a hazard or harmful to those assets. So the National Weather Service has this image, and it shows that basically six inches of water can knock over and carry away an adult. Anything higher is more dangerous. 12 inches can carry away a small car, and 18 to 24 inches can carry away most large SUVs, vans, and trucks. When we think about council assets, some of them are like bus stops that are very human, pedestrian focused, and if a bus stop is under a foot of water, that's going to be a really serious big deal to the people who want to take the bus. But that 6 to 12 inches is not as big a deal for bus routes, which could probably get through 1 to 2 feet. So we wanted to come up with a way to divide these Bluespots that we could use to look at these 6 inches, 12 inches increments. What we did was we assigned a relative risk within the Bluespots based on the likelihood and consequences. And so we came up with 4 flood hazard categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary, and then something called shallow. So how it works is if you start with the Bluespot and you start at the very bottom, this would be the lowest point in that Bluespot. The water, when it starts to rain, it'll start filling there, so it's 0 feet. And then as it keeps flooding, it gets wider. And that part of the Bluespot that will flood when the water is 0 to 2 feet deep is what we call the primary Bluespot. That's what floods first. It's what's going to flood deeper. Once the water fills up and gets above 2 feet, it gets out to this medium blue donut, and that's the area that's going to flood when the water gets between 2 and 4 feet. We call that the secondary, and above that is the tertiary. So the Bluespot, in the Bluespot, primary will always flood first and deepest, then secondary, then tertiary. Totally separately, we have these little shallow guys that are blue spots that can only get to at maximum 1 feet. So they're just little shallow depressions. They might, fill up 6 inches and then they overflow. Those pose a threat to certain of the assets we looked at, but in general are pretty low risk. If you think about your backyard, it may have a 6-inch depression, like it's not really hurting very much. So we wanted to keep those in, but really keep them as a separate data set when needed. So that's how we divided this up. And going back to our July 16th example, so we had Lindale and 22nd is right there, and the other one was Garfield and 22nd. And you can see both of those are within the primary blue spot. What I said based on the pictures, I think that flooded about 3 to 4 feet deep. So that probably means it flooded somewhere in this intermediate blue area. This blue spot has a maximum depth of over 13 feet, but to get that deep, it would have to fill all the way up all of this, get all the way up to 94. That's unlikely to happen. So there's some ground truthing to our method. There are a lot of limitations to this analysis, and I don't want to make light of those. It's not based on any rainfall amounts, and it does not account for any stormwater infrastructure. It's basically a worst case scenario. It starts raining, here's a low point, it rains, fills it up, and then it overflows. Those low spots are all gonna have storm sewer. Based on the landscape, it's really gonna depend on the landscape, and the shape of the low spot are really gonna determine what rainfall events fill it up to different depths. So there's that, and then as I showed you, the elevation data in the Twin Cities is also from 2011. That's getting older every day. There are parts of the cities, especially parts of the urban core, that aren't changing very much, but for instance, along the Green Line on University, the LiDAR was all flown before that happened, so the DEM in that area is not very accurate, and this analysis then is not very accurate. There is an initiative at the state to update LiDAR. They're basically right now writing a business case. They're going to start interviewing contractors, and they're hoping to have the entire state flown again by 2025. So I'm very supportive of that, but it costs a lot of money, and that shows that they're not able to do it very often. Another limitation is that those flood impact zones I showed, the primary, secondary, and tertiary, they're really based on what was useful for the council. Another community or organization trying to use this data might want to divide that blue spot up differently. So what we like to say as a disclaimer is that this data is really used for high-level screening and prioritization, and should be considered where potential vulnerability may occur to flooding in event of stormwater infrastructure or being overwhelmed. Infrastructure failure or the storm sewer being overwhelmed. I think that's what happened at Lindale on 22nd, is that storm sewer was just overwhelmed. If you identify a location that you think might be vulnerable to flooding, we recommend getting a lot more site-specific information, the storm sewer, and doing an in-depth analysis at that level. So that's our screening tool we developed to help us look at assets. What does this process look like? So the council, as I said, has its finger on a lot of different systems in the metro. We own and operate a small amount of housing, quite a few facilities when you throw in our wastewater and bus facilities, but also like our headquarters in downtown St. Paul. All of the transit infrastructure, and then our large wastewater collection system. But we also have a planning and collaboration role in land use, transportation, which tends to mean highways and bike routes, regional parks and trails, water resources, and water supply. So we've done some level of analysis in all of these. For transit, we've looked at bus routes, light rail commuter lines, transit stops, roadways, highways, and the regional bicycle network. I'm just going to show you some of the bus infrastructure. So this is back to our lovely Lindale and 22nd intersection. We'd actually already pulled this example out for presentations before the July 16th event occurred. It was just a really good, which also means bad, example of threats to transit infrastructure. So we know that this is where it flooded really bad in July. What these mean is the light red to dark red lines show where the bus routes have a lot of risk. So the super maroon is where there's the very highest vulnerability for that bus route. And then the circles show transit stops and their risks. So at Lyndale and 24th, there are a number of transit stops that are located within a primary blue spot. At Franklin, this information can be useful to Metro Transit as they're thinking about if they potentially at some point want to move a bus stop, or if they want to think about alternate routes in case of flooding. You know, Hennepin over here isn't really very high risk at all, so you know, that would have been a good place to detour the bus to on that July 16th. So we can use this information to do some planning of routes and bus stops. We also looked at the bus routes with the highest number of bus stops in blue spots. So here is the 4 is the one that goes up Lyndale. And so it has over 90 bus stops in a blue spot. This is not very useful for comparative purposes because every bus line is different, but it is if Metro Transit wants to sort of really target certain bus routes that have the highest risk of flooding. This would be a good place for them to really delve into each of these bus lines. For wastewater, we looked at our wastewater treatment facilities and facility access. So that's in a flooding event, would our staff be able to get to the wastewater treatment plant to operate it? Our lift stations, meters that monitor how much flow is in each interceptor, maintenance holes, so access to that system, and then our interceptors, which are our regional wastewater pipes. We didn't look at any local community wastewater systems. This is all our receiving system, so communities tap into to our system and they would have to do their own analysis. One thing we were really interested in for wastewater was infiltration and inflow concern. I don't know how familiar you guys are with wastewater, but infiltration and inflow is when clear water gets into a wastewater system during flow events. In the Twin Cities, we're really lucky that we have separated wastewater and storm sewer systems. So normally we have a pretty low flow in our wastewater systems. During high flow events, if we have a lot of water getting into not well sealed maintenance holes or into privately owned storm wastewater, sanitary sewer, like in my yard, then the flow in our pipes can go way up. And that means we often have to upsize our pipes and potentially our treatment plants to handle that wet weather flow. If we can keep that infiltration and inflow low, then we don't have to upsize as much. So the Metropolitan Council has been really focused on reducing infiltration and inflow over, I think, at least the last 15 years. And they're always looking for ways that they can cut that out. So think about a maintenance hole. Usually they're in the lid for a maintenance hole is usually in the middle of the street. And if water ponds over that, it's just sitting there for a while. There's a really good opportunity for infiltration and inflow. There are some options to deal with that. There's some waterproofing solutions for maintenance holes. So we looked at all the maintenance holes that the council has. This is on 38th Street near Cedar in South Minneapolis. And so these 1, 2, 3, 4 maintenance holes are all in a primary or shallow blue spot where water, if storm sewer ever backs up, water is just going to sit on top of those. So we wanted to give this list to our wastewater operators as a way to prioritize inspection of these maintenance holes, that they can come out, take a look if it's sealed enough, and potentially seal it and get rid of a source of I&I. We were able to look at each of our interceptors and rank them by how many maintenance holes they have in a blue spot, which they're shown here. And this also can really help prioritize if we have information about a certain interceptor that we've seen has really high I&I flow. We might be able to look at this chart and say, oh, it also has a really high number of maintenance holes in a blue spot. Let's put that at the top of our list. Let's get a crew out there and start looking at it systematically. So we have a lot of meter information for our interceptors, and so that meter information peaking factor could be paired with this maintenance hole chart to help prioritize. Water supply is a little bit different. We don't own any assets, but we have a very large planning role to help communities and the whole region work together to have a sustainable drinking water supply. For this, we really focused on groundwater. As a water supply, the region is currently about 75% sourced by groundwater and 25% sourced by surface water, so a lot of the region drinks groundwater. What we looked at here were domestic wells, which especially on the outskirts, 7 counties, there's still quite a few private wells. Inner wellhead management zone, which is the area around private water supplies that could contaminate the well, and that those private water supplies tend to be like mobile home parks. And then the emergency response area, which is part of the wellhead protection area for public water supplies. An example of one of the analysis we did for this was for private wells. We pulled all of those off of the Minnesota Well Index, and we drew a 50-foot buffer around each of them to see which of those are located in a primary blue spot. And the thought was that those wells and the drinking water supply could potentially be contaminated directly if a well is overtopped during a flood event, or indirectly through standing water that infiltrates. And so again, this is a way that we can work with communities to potentially target inspection of wells. I know Edina, the city of Edina is doing a very similar exercise, and they're looking at using this kind of analysis to target abandoned wells, which are one of the highest risks to water supplies, because often homes had a well that they don't use and the home is sold a couple times. Nobody knows there's a well there. It's often cut off at the surface and not well sealed. And that's would be a really easy source of contamination. And so what the city like Edina has been doing house by house inspections where they think there's a well, and then there's a way you seal them using concrete. So it's very straightforward to seal them if you know it's there. But if you have a lot to try and target, one way to target would be which of these are in the primary blue spot and are most likely to flood. So those are just some of the analysis we've done. And so in summary, blue spots are really just the beginning, and the world is full of them. They're just low spots in the landscape. So just because an asset is located in a blue spot, it does not mean it will ever flood. We think of this tool as really looking for potential flood vulnerability, and we encourage always doing more site-specific analysis if you can. Love for you to look at our analysis at metrocouncil.org/CBA. We tried to put together tools that can be really useful to communities and partners. So we have a localized flooding story map that really goes over a lot of what I just talked about. So it walks through the method and how to use it. And then we have a flood screening map that is a GIS map that you can just go in, pan around, look at your house, look at something you're interested in, see if it's in a blue spot. And then this data is available to download from the Geospatial Commons. It's very large, so I would recommend downloading a geodatabase if you want to do that. And that is all. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Great presentation. It's like a really useful analysis. It seems like the next logical step would be to see where the stormwater drainages are, and do you have plans to do that?
We don't, because it's sort of beyond our purview to get in deep like that. I know a number of cities, like I've heard several talks by Edina, which is why they're very familiar. They've done a model for all of this stuff. So like this data is not very useful to them because they have better data. And I think Hennepin County has also been using this. So for us, no, but we would encourage doing that in locations if you're sort of zoomed in. One of the main users beyond the council that we envision this data for would be smaller communities, probably farther outside the urban core, that don't have very much capacity or like tax funding to really do their own analysis. So this can be used for them. I'd also be happy to answer any questions about life in a agency after being in water resource science and what it's like to be a practicing scientist. So.
Well, I wanted to ask about, because it came up a few times in your talk about the purview of Metro Council and how it seems like sometimes with this analysis, you run up to the boundaries of what Metro Council have the capacity and the funding to actually do in machete. And I'm just wondering if we could talk about that more generally. I'm curious about it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's not a hard and fast rule. The council was founded in 1967 and really just did planning at that time. And then independently, there was the transit agency and there was the Metropolitan Waste Control Commission that did wastewater. And they merged in 1995, which is always, I mean, it's still like there's unclear fuzzy lines about what the purview is. Wastewater is very clear because we consider communities to be our customers. They pay us to take their waste. So we really have some ability to ask them to do things. Other like water supply planning, we do have some we do have state statute to do a lot of different things. Like I'm in water resources, which deals with surface water, and we have state statute to do some monitoring and do some technical assistance, but those are sort of really broad terms. And the same with water supply planning is that we've been given a planning role, but nothing beyond that. And so then a lot of what we can do is based on collaboration and goodwill. And then once I think we have really goodwill, we can push a little harder. So and it's the Met Council is really political. There's every 2 years, there's always some proposal in the legislature to change it, usually to make the council itself, which is has members at least partly elected, but also to just break off parts and get rid of parts. So it's not an easy answer, and it's one I'm constantly struggling or thinking about. So, but also, yeah, I think one thing I've enjoyed about my job is I think in the past, most government was very much, statutory driven, like here are rules, you will follow them. And we've hit a wall with that. It works so far, but not beyond that. And I think what I really like about this project is we want to be a partner to communities, and we're saying here is a value add for you, we hope. We want you to use it because it'll also make you a better member of this region. So, yeah.
You talked a bit about ground truth verification using the Twitter photos. Would there be any value to getting some citizens involved and trying to do more of that so that you can get a better idea of where the worst spots really are and whether they correlate to your
that's a good idea. We haven't thought about it too much. I think we could, so definitely keep that in mind. We do have the council staff photographer said, just give me a map and I will go out during an event and I will take pictures. And we were like, it's really dependent on not only how much rain, but how fast and where. And I was like, great, good luck. I'm not sure in 2 years he's really gotten much. So I think the citizen idea is good because that's where people are. But I think that would be a really good use of citizens.
And a lot of times the fact that you have a storm sewer doesn't really matter all that much because the rain comes in such a large amount in such a short time that they don't have the capacity to really remove the water quickly.
Nope.
And so you often get a lot of that ponding, even when those structures are there.
Yeah, that, and then also if they aren't maintained very well, and I don't know if you guys are very aware of adopted drain programs, but St. Paul and Minneapolis have been working on programs where a resident will adopt the drain in front of their house, and then they'll make sure it's clear of leaves and grass and I think hopefully snow, because you can have even if it's really well sized, if it's covered, especially in leaf matter, it won't function. Same with, and I used to have some pictures of last winter. I really don't want to think about snow, so I took them out. But in March or April, this year was really bad in terms of huge snowpack, and then it got warm really fast. And we went out, this is the best bonding we've done with our neighbors. We went out with our shovels, and I was using Google Street View to try and figure out where the storm sewer was because there's no indication. And I think it's right here. And then we dig for 20 minutes and then you find it. And because we had ponding water almost a foot deep in our road that couldn't drain at all because of the snow. And then you find it and it's really cool the way it just all flushes away. But,
I'll also let you know if I have other
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm looking at your map, which I really recommend to everybody because it's that TCF bank is sitting in the Bluespot, the stadium. Anyway, there's like, it's like, oh, what's in the Bluespot?
Yeah, which, and that could be because when it was flown, it was a pit from being constructed. So that's like again, at this scale, like we couldn't ground truth everything and be like, no, that's wrong. It's just like, this is the data. We here's a disclaimer, it may or may not be right. So a lot of buildings also, even if it was built, buildings are really hard for the digital elevation model to handle. Like they try and come up with a building free model, but that's trying to figure out how tall the buildings are and subtracting them off. And so when you see a building, it's always a little bit sketchy.
Okay,
But it also might be flooding, so I don't.
No, it's cool. It's just, it's kind of interesting, super interesting. I feel like you should mine Twitter, like there's already doing citizens.
Yeah.
But anyway, so my real question is, the flooding. So it seems like my council, a lot of the strategies are about, you know, avoiding these areas during the flood. But I guess I'm interested in like long-term impacts of repeated flooding on the infrastructure. I mean, maybe that's not really in your guys' purview. Other people who, you know, have to actually manage the hardscape and stuff. But is it kind of like, I mean, does more need to be done to prevent flooding in these areas so that there's not, you know, a lot of cost at infrastructure? Or is it really not that big a deal to get flooded every?
Yes, it is. And I mean, one thing I didn't talk about, but there was a really useful paper, I think it was out of Maryland and like Texas A&M or something, that really talked about this urban flooding, and they were really focused on basement flooding, which, because we were looking a lot at our assets, we weren't really thinking about, but just all the costs to community, and especially often that's in you know, poor areas that are already being ignored, and that's something we did a project with this with some Humphrey students to look a little bit at the human impact. They really looked at it, they were only able to look at it from a census tract level, I think. But we would really like to look more at this with an equity lens, and we just haven't really had a chance. So like, yes, I think there's certain kinds of flooding that are okay, and you just know where it is. In Copenhagen, after they had a really, really intense event where cars were just underwater, they've been really working on pairing underground storm sewer with above ground swales where, you know, they can handle the water in a safe way. And that's the same. I know a lot of communities are looking at ways to use you know, parks, both gently as a park and as a place to temporarily store water. So it needs to go somewhere. And you know, I think you can look at reducing hardscapes coupled with storage, coupled with behavior. I know South Minneapolis, in a part we didn't look at, they're looking at some really expensive underground storage vaults that I don't think they're ever going to be able to afford just for like one small area. So it's like, if that's not feasible, what are some other options? So yeah, Ben.
I have lots of questions. I was just thinking, has anyone done the like envelope calculation of summing the volume that's in all of these depressions and comparing it to certain return period storm for the volume you might expect from marine flow event? Has anyone done that?
I have not. The way the Danes did this was they calculated that volume, and then I can't remember, but they basically figured out percentages of how full they would be. Now I can't remember, but it's really hard because it's, you know, based on the watershed, but it's also really based on the shape of the depression. I think I was trying to look at how full each of, like, a 5-year storm would fill it up this much, a 10-year storm would fill it up this much. That's really hard. I actually think looking at the entire thing, the entire Bluespot, and then back calculating is more straightforward, but then there's things like that Egan one, and I think the return period for that might be 100,000 years. So, and that's sort of what the Danes were doing, is they were looking at that and saying, this one will only fill up 0.01% with a 100-year storm. And I'm like, but the area where it does flood, the small part of that, there might be damage. So we've looked at lots of ways to extend it and sort of stopped here. I think it would be, that would be very easy to do for like a small area. So, and I think I did start looking at it. I don't know if you guys have ever been under the 36th bridge by Rosedale Mall, but it floods a lot. Now they have signs that say avoid during flooding, which is smart. I started looking at that as like an individual situation, looking at each of the 2-foot contours, and it was interesting, but it was hard to replicate. But if you find a way, I mean, the state we met with the state and they're thinking about extending this to like Duluth, some other cities outstate, and I really didn't want them to just take this method and apply it. I really wanted them to think about what they were doing, and if they could come up with a better, like take it to the next step, I would love that. So anybody who wants to take this to the next step, I would love to partner. We just don't have capacity right now. So I'm not sure how that's going to pan out in the state.
There is somebody at the Humphrey Institute that I met with. I just can't think of her name. I'll look it up.
Yeah.
She was interested in kind of doing this similar sort of assessment, but looking at where the flood, or where these like most prone areas match up with demographics and green space and that sort of thing. And, I was using, as part of another project, a model that is also pretty simple, but it just uses the DEM and infiltration properties on a grid and predicts where floods are going to go based on some machine learning algorithm that had nothing to do with the borrowing the software. But anyway, this woman found out that I was working on this project. She said, well, how can we validate this? You know, if we want to go out and understand what flooding is going to be in a certain part of the city for a certain size storm, can I just go out and put a pressure transducer on a street pole or something? And so I don't know where she ended up. You know, she wanted to ground truth it in some way. I would never have thought of Twitter, but that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's cool. During events, if you look at hashtag MNWX, that's what a lot of people seem to do for Minnesota weather. So that's, I don't know, this is how I'm learning about Twitter.
In any case, there is somebody working on trying to figure out a way to ground truth some of the localized flooding.
Yeah, no, if you'd send me your info, that would be great. So I'd love to have a work off of this. Yeah.
Already missed this part about keeping your flood hazard distribution. So that also match up with the existing city plans, because I was doing some of the lowland, but that's what I was based on. Lowland. Probably has already connected to some sewer system. So probably I missed it, but I feel like I didn't recall this part. Would you explain a little more about how they're connected to each other?
So sorry, could you repeat that?
First of all, yeah, does your map for flood hazard connect to any one of the urban plans in the past, or the most ongoing urban plan? So, because I assume that many areas which was lowland have already connected to other infrastructures that will alter the flood hazard. So I don't.
Got it. No, because we don't know where that storm sewer is. So, you know, like it would if that connection is done over land, you know, if they put a swale between them, yes. But because we don't know, you know, in this city where the storm sewer is, and what size, probably more importantly, what size it is, you know, for storm sewer, it's often how many catch basins do you have and what's their capacity. We don't know that, so it doesn't. That's why it's really that worst case scenario. And that's why, but it's both the worst case scenario, and I'm always surprised by situations like Lindsay on 22nd where it floods so poorly. I do think those happen the most in the urban core. I used to do development reviews for like Farmington or Egan. They really build a lot more of this in. They have road overflows that they account for so that homes don't flood. So newer communities, other than when we're talking, putting climate change aside, other communities based on the storms they design for are usually in pretty good shape. You can't put climate change aside, so they're going to have some serious issues. But the main areas that have issues in this region are the older cities. that answer? I mean, the answer is not really.
Okay.
And we'd love it if it did. So it's not that I think it shouldn't, it's that we haven't been able to go that far. Budget and I think just really effort and budget, both. So if you have either of those, I'd happily take them.
Okay, well,
Great. Thank you.
Some more.
Have you adopted your grade?
Oh my God.
I know, I called it a welfare check, because I know the people who adopted the grade and they were